So hello, CEMBA organizational behavior students. We had a really great first weekend, and I'm excited to keep moving forward in our material. We didn't quite get through this last bit of the individual performance material on feedback. So as promised, I'm going to record about 3 short little videos here to present the material. And that way, if you watch this material, sort of think about some of the question prompts before we come to class on the 19th. We'll be set to go and we'll do those role plays with the 4 mini cases to start out with, and then kind of use that to debrief some of this content around feedback. So if we think about feedback, so I would put this in the context of motivation and performance management is what we were discussing in class. And we talked about this in, for example, goal setting theory, that goals provide a form of feedback, because if we have a goal set and we know what we're trying to achieve, we can engage in self-regulatory processes to see, oh, have we met the goal? No, we need to continue working. We need to persist, or we need to adapt our effort. But feedback is necessary in motivational processes, regardless of whether goals are there, and for people to understand how to adapt their performance to be more effective. So, of course, we have lots of things we have to think about when we think about being effective at our jobs. But as we think about developing into leaders and having more responsibility over people and having people execute our strategies and our plans, feedback is one of those kinds of tools that's really vital. And the moment you're in some kind of supervisory leadership role, you will have to engage in forms of feedback to be effective at leading others. And so I had you read a couple articles, and the background should be kind of apparent from those, but for example, just in McKinsey alone, people estimate that the coaching or kind of feedback activities consume, about 20% of the partner's time. So it's a significant amount of time that goes into feedback giving and feedback seeking activities in organizations. But I also had you look at some other readings that kind of poke holes at this, and also I think should suggest why we need to talk about this, why we need to consciously analyze and study feedback processes and how to make them more effective. Because there's also some research that suggests, and this is not just one paper or the HBR that I assigned, but that most people don't like feedback. And if you think about yourself, I think you have to think through, like, how many times in your career have you gotten feedback that you really enjoyed getting or you really felt was effective? For some of us, there probably were a few. I have a few of those situations where I can recall. In some cases, it was hard and it was critical and it was, it was difficult to hear. But because those were these sharp moments where I could adapt and adjust my behavior, and I saw a positive outcome, I can look back on that and say that was really an important thing. Now, whether that was effectively delivered, that's another question, because it may be necessary to hear feedback, but if it's not effectively delivered, it may not have the effects we want. And one of the biggest ways that feedback is given in organizations are annual performance reviews. And it'll be interesting just to hear a little bit from you all when we come back together in class, what your organizations do around that, if you're still doing kind of the once-a-year annual review, or if there are more regular pulsed processes of that, etc. But we did read this article that particularly focused on Deloitte, and in that article, the researchers, gave this statistic that the average U.S. organization spends $3,000 per year per employee. That should be a rather shocking statistic on performance evaluations. So, one question I'd have is, are you getting $3,000 more productivity out of people from that expense? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think there's at least some sense of dissatisfaction that this isn't necessarily providing the incentives and the motivation kind of impact that we think it should. In the article that I assigned from Harvard Business Review, I think was even more shocking when Deloitte sort of turned the lens on itself and did their own evidence-based management. They did their own research, and they found that they were using around 2 million hours a year on performance evaluations. That's astonishing. And if we think about where that effort could be going on, productive task work, we have to stop and ask ourselves if that's really worth it. So I think there's some growing evidence that feedback, at least in the form of performance evaluations, isn't as effective as we would like it to be, and it actually is extremely costly. So here, a question is, is it worth it? I have to move this a little bit here so you can see the whole slide. Maybe now it's getting goofy. But basically, is it worth it? Well, by now, after reading some of the things you've read, you might start to wonder. But this idea of feedback interventions is a very popular and common kind of managerial tool, and has become really one of the most accepted ideas in psychology, that feedback mechanisms are vital for this kind of regulation of behavior and this motivational processes. And inside of feedback are this idea of knowledge of results, suggestions for improvements, incentives and punishment, right? So several things we talked about with respect to motivation processes are all right here, right? That, the goals kind of give you this, and giving people feedback of actually how they're performing, and even the idea of intrinsic motivation. When the work itself kind of, what's happening, there's more motivational quality. This is sort of the feedback about maybe in the expectancy chain, some of these other theories we were talking about, where understanding, does performance actually produce the outcome? Does effort create the performance we're looking for? And then, what's tied to that? And, feedback is part of that, is part of the outcomes. It's part of delivering on some of those incentives or rewards. But, here's the big question, does it really work? Well, here we have meta-analysis again, so we know that's, kind of a level 1 type of evidence. And this paper's been around for a while, so some of this is also one of those question marks about why does knowledge we know not get translated into the workplace. But basically, we do see that feedback interventions are related to and statistically significant, connected to performance or learning. But this is the big astonishing thing. In about a third of the cases, it actually produced negative results. So getting feedback actually harmed performance. So again, maybe pause the video for a moment and think about that. Think about situations, could you think of a situation where you got feedback and actually your performance was harmed? Well, I can, right? Because if someone gives you feedback and it doesn't feel correct, or doesn't feel genuine, or it feels like it's a blind side, or feels like it's the timing is off, that we can't really do anything about it, the kind of negative emotions can actually backfire and maybe make us less inclined to even work at that point. So we can kind of come up with reasons why we might have found those statistics. And ultimately, this is also a rather shocking statistic here. Another big paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology, one of the top applied organizational psychology journals, found that what really drove the variance in outcomes of feedback was qualities of the person giving feedback. So that means that it's not really about you. It might be more about me and my personality and kind of my peculiarities about why you're getting the kind of feedback you're getting or when you're getting it. Only the performance of the person receiving feedback only accounted for 21% of the variance in the performance effects that happened from the feedback. So the authors concluded that most of what we end up measuring in performance evaluation is kind of unique noise about the rater. So what do we do about this? Some things you could think about is, you probably don't want just one rater if you can help it, because if all you're getting a rating from is your boss, and that person has particular, personality characteristics, maybe certain biases, whether those are explicit or implicit biases, you may be getting a lot of that kind of noise that's not a very accurate depiction. And then if you turn it around on yourself, it's also really, really vital to understand that we're not very good at doing this, that we are subject to a whole bunch of informational biases. We'll talk more about that in, I guess, about 4 weeks from now, to think through that and come back to think about the implications for these sorts of performance reviews. So a question here, is what would you recommend doing? If you have this information now, this is evidence. It's pretty good evidence that feedback processes that are typically used, which are usually performance reviews and performance evaluations, but even kind of spontaneous feedback usually isn't that good and not that effective. So you could pause your video here and just stop for a minute and think through. So this said to discuss, maybe just think through a little bit about what was identified in the article about Deloitte. Like, what did they do? And what do you think about their methods and their evidence? Do you think that their plans were actually based on some pretty good analyses and thinking? Again, I'm impressed that they actually conducted their own study. They didn't just make a change based on a whim. They didn't make a change based on some kind of random feedback from a consultant. But it's still worth just stopping for a little bit, going back to that article and thinking about, what do you think about what they decided to do? Again, when we come back together, we'll share a little bit of this and get some reactions. And then finally, I wonder if you have any concerns about the solution that they actually came up with. In particular, think about the decision to ask only the immediate team leader. They did this to try to, reduce the overhead burden on this process in the organization. But maybe stop and jot down 2 or 3 problems that you think could come from this. Maybe from your own experience, from the readings, or just sort of thinking through the logic of, is that the best idea to rely on that one single person? So we had some other readings about what we could do to make these better. So, I think one answer is we may not want to throw this out. I have colleagues who would argue that it's sort of a bad idea, and it's certainly a bad idea if we're going to decide to stop formal performance evaluations and feedback and not do something else. So it cannot be left as a void, because people do need this kind of regulation and monitoring and feedback to understand how their performance is being viewed. So it isn't the case that if we remove the annual review, we shouldn't do anything. In fact, the burden gets higher to do more. But I had one article there for you to read that talks about that people don't want to be compared to others. This kind of up or down ranking, A, B, C, G, E, the bottom number 3s get fired every year. People don't like that, number one, and it creates a sort of negative climate in the organization. People don't tend to go out of their way to help each other or provide backup behaviors when you create that sort of competitive environment or atmosphere. Of course, people may need to be fired. You may need to replace people if they're not performing, but doing it in kind of a forced ranking is not a particularly effective tool. This article talked more about that people like to be compared to themselves. And what that means is having metrics that are goals for my improvement. So what did I do last year on this particular set of work criteria? What are our goals, sort of mutually, you as my boss, me together? What would we say we'd like to see changing this year? And look at that line of trend. And there's 2 things about this. I put the Google logo there, and one thing about the Google Oxygen 8 and how Google went about kind of rolling that out is that they did not attach it to performance evaluations and raises. They made it part of the development of their employees. And here's where, feedback is going to be most effective, when it's seen as something that is really genuinely trying to improve and develop somebody, rather than sort people with that sorting hat and stick them in a bucket and decide, who's the top performer, who's the bottom performer. And of course, that may occur if you have a merit-based system. We already talked about all the kind of problems with merit-based systems, and one of those is exactly this thing about trying to do these sorts of evaluations and sorting. The reason that the comparison question comes into play is just a reminder about justice theory. And really, most people feel that performance evaluations are fair if you kind of do surveys of people, if we do this sort of internal metric looking at people's development versus comparison. These sort of comparing and ranking, people almost always uniformly feel have some degree of interpersonal injustice, procedural justice, and distributive justice problems. And we already saw that with cases of Wells Fargo. We saw that with cases of the research article that I shared by Jerry Greenberg, that once we start getting sense of inequity or injustice in organizations, all sorts of bad behaviors start to happen. So one key takeaway is that if you are going to engage in some kind of performance review, that it should be developmental and it should be within or intra-person versus this kind of forced ranking. So, to summarize, if you're going to do performance reviews, if you're going to keep these in your organizations, the best practices are to focus on temporal comparisons, not this kind of social ranking comparison. We do have to address rater bias. We do know that most of the performance outcomes are predicted by the peculiarities of the rater and not actually about the behavior of the person being rated. So we have a big problem in that if we just kind of cut loose people on doing this, they may not be engaging in practices that are actually sound in terms of their perception and judgment processes. And that is why when people get feedback and it doesn't feel genuine, it doesn't feel accurate representation of their performance or their behaviors, that we actually have much more negative effects, which is why we see those meta-analytical results that in a third of the cases, an attempt at improving performance through feedback actually harms performance. And then the other thing is, I think even a better solution is to, in fact, not have feedback be this one giant premium on one time a year in a performance review, but move to some kind of model like Deloitte where they made a decision. You have to think about what the appropriate timing is. They're a project-based consulting organization. So, kind of thinking about giving a significant feedback after the close of each project, or if a project's very long, year, multi-year, having specific quarterly targets or gates or something where the feedback is provided is important. The other thing I think is really quite interesting is that they now require, as part of leadership in that organization, that leaders check in with every single team member at least once a week. So this is trying to make a culture change of feedback being just a regularly occurring process. And you can think about the benefits of this, that it doesn't become quite as threatening. If everybody is compelled to do this on a regular basis and knows it's going to happen on a regular basis, it just becomes the fabric of the organizational life, and it doesn't feel as threatening that maybe something's really wrong or that you've maybe made a big mistake. And obviously you can make better course corrections if you're getting sort of micro feedback all along the way. But again, it'll be interesting for you to share with us when we get back to class, where are your organizations on this, and where are you in terms of feedback for merit and pay and other kinds of incentive processes versus development processes? Where are you in terms of training? Where do you find your information about giving feedback? Is it just sort of left up to kind of you absorbing what's happened to you, or have you been trained in some way, shape, or form about this? So we'll be talking more about that when we get back together. So the final thing for this little recording is that I hope what's clear is that all of this puts a premium on feedback as an essential leadership skill. There's no way around it, and I think the trends are going to continue, that we're going to probably see more pressure away from kind of targeted once a year performance evaluations and into some other kind of model that represents or kind of reflects research showing us that more frequent feedback that's developmental, and feedback that's target kind of within person development are all more effective than feedback that's once in a while, that's connected to rewards and punishment, and that is given maybe by just one single person without any consideration for some of the rater problems, rater biases that come into play that can harm the ultimate benefits of feedback.